Most people tell you who they are, not with their words, not with social media, their social media, not with the version of themselves they present to the world. They tell you through their behaviour. And once you start seeing that, it's very difficult to unsee. Because one of the most fascinating things about human beings is that we spend an incredible amount of time listening to what people say. Point in case. However, while largely ignoring what they repeatedly do, we believe promises, we believe explanations, we believe intentions. Yet behaviour is usually sitting there in plain sight, quietly telling the truth. Think about it for a moment. Have you ever met someone who constantly talks about loyalty, yet disappears the moment things become difficult? Older we get, the more we see, sadly. I digress. Or someone talks endlessly about discipline, yet never follows through on the things they commit to, right? Or perhaps someone says they value relationships, but never make time for the people they claim matter most. Before we dive in here, the point isn't criticism. The point is observation. Because behaviour leaves clues. And clues, well, they tell stories. Most people are walking around broadcasting information about themselves every single day. The problem is not that the information isn't there. The problem is that most people aren't trained to see it. Yeah. We're trained to listen. We're trained to explain. Hell, we're trained to justify. And we're trained to excuse. But we are rarely trained to observe. And observation, wow, that changes everything. Imagine watching somebody for 6 months. Let me pause. I've made a great cup of coffee today. It's only black with 0 sugar, but do you know what? It works for me. Yeah, imagine watching somebody for 6 months. Not listening to their explanations, not listening to their promises, not listening to their plans. Just watching. What time do they arrive? How do they treat people when they gain nothing from it? How do they behave under pressure? Very telling. How do they react when challenged? Very telling. And what happens when things don't go their way? How do they handle disappointment? How do they handle success? Right? And you have to wonder how they handle overall responsibility. You would learn an enormous amount about that person, far more than most conversations could ever reveal. And this isn't because people are dishonest, at least not always anyway. In many cases, people genuinely believe the things that they say. They believe they're patient. They believe they're confident most of the time. They believe they're calm. And they believe they're disciplined. And that's interesting. But behaviour often reveals something deeper. Because behaviour isn't built from intention. Behaviour is built from conditioning. Experience, emotion, habits, beliefs, and of course, your nervous system response or responses. Which means somebody can sincerely believe one thing about themselves while repeatedly demonstrating something completely different. Fascinating, right? And this is where human behaviour genuinely becomes fascinating. Because what people do repeatedly tends to reveal what is operating underneath the surface. Not what they wish was true, not what sounds good, not what would make them look better, but what is actually driving them. And once you understand that, you start noticing patterns everywhere. You begin noticing that the person who always needs to be right isn't really arguing about facts. They're protecting certainty. You begin noticing that person who constantly seeks validation isn't necessarily seeking attention. They're seeking safety. You begin noticing that the person who becomes defensive at the slightest criticism often isn't protecting their opinion. They're protecting their identity. Think about that. The behaviour is visible. The cause sits underneath it. Most people only see the behaviour. Observation allows you to become curious about what created it. And that's a very different way of looking at people. Instead of asking, what's wrong with them? I suppose you start asking, what might be driving that behaviour? And that question alone changes how you see the world. As somebody who has spent years working with people through massage therapy, personal training, through coaching, conversations, through energy work, I've learned something very interesting. People reveal themselves incredibly quickly, usually within minutes. Not because they mean to, but because behaviour is difficult to hide for long. A person who is anxious often reveals it. A person who is confident often reveals it. A person who feels insecure often reveals it. A person who carries a lot of anger often reveals it. Not necessarily through words, but through patterns, tone, body language, reaction, and choices, and timing. And once you start paying attention to patterns rather than individual moments, the picture becomes much clearer. Because anybody can have a bad day. Anybody can become emotional. Anybody can react poorly once in a while. That's human. But patterns tell stories. Repeated patterns tell deeper stories. And consistent patterns tell the deepest stories of all. Think about the people around you. Not critically, just honestly. What patterns do you see? Who consistently keeps their word? Who consistently avoids responsibility? Who consistently shows kindness? And who consistently creates drama? Here's a good one. Who consistently grows? And who consistently stays stuck? Over time, those patterns become increasingly difficult to ignore, because behaviour leaves evidence. Now, here's where this becomes even more important. This isn't only about observing other people. It's about observing yourself. Because the same principles apply, right? You are constantly telling the world who you are. Not through intentions, through your behaviour, your routines, your habits, your reactions, your choices, your consistency, your excuses, your actions. They're all broadcasting information every single day. And that's where observation becomes uncomfortable. Because once you start observing yourself honestly, you begin seeing things you previously missed. You begin noticing where your actions and your goals don't match. You begin noticing where your words and behaviours aren't aligned. You begin noticing patterns that have quietly been running your life for years. And not because you're broken, and not because you failed, but because awareness always reveals something. The interesting thing is that awareness doesn't immediately change behaviour. Many people think it does. It doesn't. Awareness simply turns the light on. The behaviour may continue for a while. The habit may continue. The reaction may continue. But now you can see it. And once you can see it, you have a choice. You have a choice. This is why observation is such a powerful skill. Because observation sits before change. Before growth. Before improvement. before transformation, you cannot change what you cannot see. And you cannot see clearly if you're constantly reacting. So perhaps the question isn't, who are people telling me they are? Perhaps the better question is, why are people repeatedly showing me? Because most people tell you who they are every day. Through behaviour, through patterns, through actions, consistency. The clues are usually there. The signals are usually there. The evidence is usually there. I suppose the challenge is learning to notice it. That's the real bit there. And once you do, you begin understanding people differently. You begin understanding yourself differently. And you begin realizing something incredibly simple. Human behaviour is constantly communicating. The question is, are you paying attention? In the next episode, we're going deeper into one of the most powerful influences on human behaviour. And that is how your environment quietly shapes who you become.